When you look at those 2 touchdown drives, you look at one, it was 10 plays, 96 yards, 6.5 minutes long. And then the second one, 14 plays, 75 yards, 2.5 minutes. Who was the biggest spark?
To me, it was Tyler Lockett. And first of all, I thought, last week we talked a little bit about this, that I thought he was going to have kind of a breakout game. Now, was it? Not really. I mean, he didn't score a touchdown, but he had 81 yards, 8 catches. And I thought particularly, Bob, on that first drive where Geno had to run up. I think he'd gotten sacked, and then he has to climb the pocket, and he looked really fast. And that's where I was sitting there going, run it. And then all of a sudden he finds Lockett, who I don't think anybody really saw, just came out of nowhere. And Geno threw just a bullet to him. So, and then, he ends up on the other, the last drive. I think that was 14 plays, 75 yards. And Geno was 7 for 11 for 57 yards there, but on the whole thing. But, 27 of those yards were Tyler Lockett. He's just so reliable. And, I think over the last few games, it just seems like he hasn't made a bunch of big plays. We've been talking about DK. We've been talking about JSN, and not so much him, but you can only keep him down for so long. And he's just so solid, man. You just know you can rely on Tyler Lockett. So, yeah, I thought, even though he didn't have huge numbers, he was the leading receiver for the Seahawks. But on those 2 drives, I thought he was fundamental, man. He had, like I said, 21 and 27, so a total of 48 yards on those 2 drives.
D-line had a day. They were able to get to the quarterback. Why is that?
Yeah, they only had 1 sack in the first half. You know what Mark was just talking about? That, teams are kind of, they're going to prevent the big play, right? I thought the pass coverage got really good. Now, a couple of those, Dre Jones, man, I mean, how much of a relief was that sack that he got on that final drive? I mean, that entirely disrupted everything that Tannehill was doing. But, I think number one, Boye Mafe just got back in a groove, and you could see him, and this is what he does. It's like the first play, he's going to have a good pass rush, but not really be close to the quarterback. Then the next play, and like I said, these are happening in the second half. 4 of the 5 sacks were in the second half, but he gets closer and closer and closer, and then he gets there. So yeah, I think it was nice to see him get back on track with the 2 sacks. But I think Boye was number 1, but number 2, you're looking at what the coverage has been pretty good. They ran for a lot of yards, but like Mark was saying, they weren't going to let any big stuff happen over the top. And what they give up 164 yards, but the coverage, when I was looking downfield, it was tight, man. So a lot of extra time to get there.
All right, we hit on this a little bit earlier in the show, but for those that are just tuning in, we were talking about the run defense last week, 178 yards against the Eagles, and then this week 162 yards allowed against the Titans. What's happening with this run? And then if you want to go back further, both games against the 49ers were not good. They've given up a fair amount of rushing yards. What's happening?
Yeah, well, one of the things is by design, and we heard Pete Carroll talk about that look, we don't want to give up the big yards. So they're putting more resources and in the back end, as far as linebackers lining up a little bit deeper and guys lining up off the ball. So it takes a while to get up there in the run game and make a play, but they just wanted to make sure nothing got over the top, and they did that, because the only explosive, and I think this all came down after that ridiculous San Francisco game where the 10th longest run was 20 yards. I mean, they had a 72-yarder and a 50-yarder. I mean, it was just ridiculous. So they're just not going to get beat. So they're, not putting as many resources, once again, up to stop the run. So here's the other thing. Our linebackers are not, I think Jordan Brooks is. And really, I think Radigan is. I think, Nick Ballore, I feel like those guys will play downhill and attack the run, but those guys aren't great in coverage. And so that's why, but I thought they really missed Jordan Brooks, because, he will come upfield and thump you. Bobby's just not great at taking on guards or sometimes willing. And then, you look at Bush, who's kind of undersized, and to me, that's kind of
he
what
looks
happened.
like a cornerback out there. He looks,
doesn't he?
Especially compared to Jordan Brooks. I mean, and both Bobby and Jordan are both put together.
dudes.
Those guys are big dudes. And then you see
Yeah.
Bush out there, and I don't know how much smaller he is in weight compared to those guys. We can look at their official listings, but he looks substantially lighter than those guys.
Yeah, I think he's like 235, 240. He's deceiving. Remember we interviewed him. He didn't have some big ripped upper body.
Yeah,
but
he's listed at 234. I'm looking at it. 5'11", 234.
Yeah, guy's got big legs. Yeah, he's just very deceiving. I can imagine. It used to annoy me that people would go, yeah, well, I thought you'd be a lot bigger. I'm like, well, how big do you think? I'm like 245 pounds.
You're supposed to be like
you're
a
not
lineman.
245. Yeah, so I think everybody thought I weighed 200 pounds. Now it's the opposite, Bob.
Yeah.
People think I'm much lighter. I'm like, oh, no, I blew past that a long time ago.
I haven't seen that number in a while.
Yeah.
How did Bush play? How did you think he played out there?
He's just okay. I mean, he got a few tackles, and he didn't do anything that was like dynamic where you're like, oh, man, we got to get this guy on the field. But, he's a solid and willing hitter. Remember on the kickoff from the first preseason game, I don't think he'd ever run down on a kickoff because he was a first-round draft choice, and that typically doesn't happen for those guys. And he just blew up the returner. I think it was, who did we play in the preseason? It was Dallas, Green Bay, and I think Minnesota. And I think it was the Minnesota game. But he will hit you, no question about it. He's got something to prove. But, yeah, he was just kind of out there. Nobody really had, a big day other than the D-line. And Boye Mafe, just awesome. We talked about that earlier. But, yeah, as far as the run defense goes, it looked like they didn't have. So I said this earlier. I'm sitting there counting the gaps. I'm going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, how many guys we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, we're one short there. And I think that's where they're lining up guys deeper, more mindful of preventing the big plays downfield, and really it worked. So, but it was just kind of, like I said, annoying watching them run, and it felt worse than it really is, but that's how it is when you get run on. It just even as a fan, you just sit there and go, oh my God, we're getting killed.
Right.
And like Mark was saying, man, blocking and hitting, all that stuff is being kind of left behind. It's all about the, like he talked about the bubble screen and everything, but just the good old-fashioned downhill, hard-hitting teams, I think are going to be rewarded in the playoffs. So, and you look at Baltimore is certainly that. Like Mark said, Dallas can be at times, but, certainly the 49ers are pretty physical. But, I feel like more than anything, if you really know what you're doing, then you can be much more aggressive, and you can come downhill, and you can hit, and you can tackle. Guys that aren't sure, they don't do that because they're not entirely convinced, which I've always said, look, if you don't know what you're doing, at least go hit somebody.